I'm here today with Natalie Bennett, who is the leader of the Green Party for England and Wales. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you very much.
Lovely. So just give us a few words. Why are you here today? You're obviously giving a talk this afternoon. What's that about?
Yeah, I'm here with the IC seminar, basically talking about energy policy and really the intersection of politics and energy policy and what we need to do to get a sensible energy policy. And what I'll be saying is that we need ideological change and perhaps change in political structures before we're going to get an energy policy that works for the common good. And that sounds like a big ask, but the sort of positive side of the story is I think both of those changes are coming very quickly.
So do you think that one affects the other, or do you think they both need to be achieved, or is it a case of that one needs to be done before the other can occur?
Well, I think one of the things I'll be talking about is this election, the coming election in 2015, is unlike any other in that there's a real possibility for things to break wide open. It's in voters' hands to elect in a parliament that looks nothing like any other. And if they do that, then we don't need political structural change necessarily. That parliament could have adopted a different kind of ideology, abandoned neoliberalism, and basically said we need to get a sensible energy policy, things like energy conservation, renewable energy, instead of chasing after fossil fuels and profits for finance companies, which is where we are now. But it's it's in the voters' hands. But if that doesn't happen, we're going to need really structural change, proportional representation, a different kind of parliament to deliver sensible energy policy results.
Now, obviously, you are the Green Party, it's evolved out of the Green movement. Are you worried that people might not see you part anything just solving green issues, or do you think this will affect how they vote?
Well, I think if you look at the history of the Green Party and Green parties around the world, it's not just necessarily the environmental movement that we come from. We come from, you put it in sort of academic type terms, the new political movements of the 60s. And that means, my first politics was feminism. I'm very passionate about feminism, things like 50-50 women in parliament, things like equal pay for women, all those kind of issues. And there's people who, obviously from the LGBTIQ community, people from all different kinds of political perspectives come together in the Green Party. And increasingly, we're very much representing and speaking up for the Labour movement, the unions, in a way that the Labour Party no longer is.
So, obviously you say you're an advocate of feminism, you are a female leader yourself. What do you think can be done within society today to empower women to really, go for those top jobs and break the supposed glass ceiling that's been imposed upon us?
Well, I think there's a wide range of things we need to do, but one of the first things we need to do is tackle the unequal pay situation. We have a situation where women workers simply aren't treated with respect. Part-time workers, who are very often women because they're combining work with caring responsibilities or for other reasons, aren't treated with respect. We need to really acknowledge the contribution of all workers are making, and at the moment there clearly is a discrimination. We need to, what we call for is a citizen's income or basic income, and that would be potentially transformatory to women and to everybody, because you can choose what you want to do with your life and you don't have to worry about the basics. And of course, we also need to very much get women in political power. The fact that we now have 22% women MPs. And it's not just that. You walk around Westminster and what you find is it's an incredibly male-dominated environment. It's not just the MPs, the staffers, the advisors, the unpaid interns, all of those people are very, very overwhelmingly male, and that's got to change.
But do you not think that it comes in, we've got to tackle the stereotypes surrounding males as well? I mean, Emma Watson, obviously, there was a big furore in the media recently about her as the women ambassador, saying that, things need to change for men as well as women. Do you think that comes into the problem at all? Or?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely an issue as well. And I think one of the things is, there are probably, quite a few men who would like to adopt different roles in life, not be the breadwinner, be the carer. But you still hear Women's Hour programs like that. They'll get a male on like that occasionally as the amazing, exceptional example, and they'll say, I was going along to the playgroup, and I was the only father, and everyone else was the mother, and they were perfectly nice, but I still fed. So there's a real tipping point there where men can feel like part of my life is caring, part of my life is working, paid work, all of those things all fit together. And one of the other things that I talk about a lot, we've really got to utterly transform society, and the New Economics Foundation suggests an idea that eventually perhaps we should gradually work towards a 21-hour working week as standard. And if we did that, we'd all have time for some caring, some play, some politics, lots more things in our life outside paid work.
Okay, so obviously, like you talk about changing society. When you were here last year giving a talk, which I attended, a lot of my peers did, it was just after Russell Brand had first come out and said that there needs to be change and revolution. Where do you stand on that now? Do you agree? I mean, obviously you agree in the principle of change, but what do you think about his campaign and trying to inspire change, particularly in young people?
Well, I talk a great deal about a peaceful revolution, and that's what I was talking about in terms of energy policy, but in terms of everything. It's within the hands of the voters. And we've really, what we've had, perhaps the most significant thing since last year in Russell Brand, is the Scottish referendum. And that was, 97% of eligible people enrolled to vote, 85% of people voted. And I was up there a couple of weeks before the referendum, and just, the mood on the streets, everyone you spoke to had a view on how they were voting or how they were trending towards voting. They could give you a coherent reason. You mightn't have agreed with it, but they could give you a reason of how they got to that conclusion. Strangers at bus stops were talking about politics. Politics had become something that everybody was doing. It wasn't something that was being done to them. And that really showed the way, the potential that, normally these days 60-65% is the turnout in general elections. If we could emulate the Scots and get an 85% turnout with, say the under 25s voting at the same rate as the over 60s vote, it really is within voters' hands to elect a very different kind of parliament. And that would potentially leave a lot more seats where 25% of the vote or not much more could elect people. And that makes it a lot more possible for people to just go, I'm going to vote for what I believe in. And so that's my suggestion for a peaceful revolution. Vote for what you believe in. Don't listen to the, it's a two-horse race here, you have to vote for the person you dislike the second most to stop the people you really hate getting in. Vote for what you believe in and give it a go and try and create a peaceful revolution that way.
Okay, now you've touched upon the general election several times there. If we look now at some specific policies or areas of policy that students are interested in that it might affect them, if we take transport for starters, now obviously your aim here is to get as many cars off the road as possible. How are you going to encourage both students and the wider public to use other methods? What strategies do you have in place for that?
Well, what we basically need to do is invest and provide that alternative provision and make it viable, pleasant, cheap and convenient. And that means starting with walking and cycling, making sure that you've got really safe, convenient ways, nice ways of doing that. If you're going to walk for half an hour to get somewhere, you want it to be as nice a walk as it can possibly be. Particularly things like local buses is a huge issue. In many places they're horribly expensive, they're not necessarily very reliable. I often do evening meetings and someone's been with me during the day and they say, I'd love to come to the meeting but the last bus to my village is 5:30. What use is that? And then moving on to investing in trains, particularly local trains, and trains that aren't lines centred on London, but that cross the country in other ways around within regions, and not building HS2, because that just focuses everything even more on London than we've got now.
And you talk about investing now, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering how this is going to be invested, where's the money coming from? I don't know if you can shed some light on that.
Well, basically, in short, what we have at the moment is we have a huge problem with multinational companies in particular and rich individuals not paying their taxes. The corporate tax take, the tax take from big companies under this government has gone down 14%. And we all know the stories, and I'll bet pretty well everyone who's watching this will have either bought or had bought for them something from Amazon, the website, in the past year. Last year they paid 0.01% of their turnover in tax. They paid no tax at all. And yet you pick any road, wherever the viewer is sitting, the road outside, there'll probably have been an Amazon lorry, if it's a weekday, running up and down that road. And all of us are paying to maintain the road, and Amazon isn't. It's a parasite. It's got to pay its way and pay to maintain the society that it depends on for its profits.
Okay, and obviously in the local area, just sticking to transport here, we had last week the introduction of the first biobus, which is run on waste, and a lot of people have commented on how invaluable it is because people can see that the recycling that they do is being invested into something. Would you perhaps encourage something like this, and how viable is that as a method of transport for students to? Well,
I think we've got to look at all kind of different things. I happened to be in Nottingham yesterday, which has, I learnt, the largest electric bus fleet in Europe, not just in Britain, and so different areas. The solution isn't necessarily one size fit all, but certainly renewable energy, using the resources that we've got, and not, for example, an issue that's still astonishingly an issue around lots of the country, not incinerating waste when it should be valuable resources, but as in this case, recycling it in good ways.
So now if we move on to something, food, for example, that's another area that I'm sure students can engage with. You stress the importance of producing more locally sourced food, more ethically sourced, getting rid of battery farms. How are you going to make this affordable? Because obviously there's a lot of students out there on budgets. There's a lot of people, who aren't students on budgets who are struggling. How is this going to be as affordable as what we've got at the moment?
Well, the problem is that, in some ways, the cheap food we have now, like so many things that are apparently cheap, have huge external costs which aren't factored into them. There was a really good study a couple of months ago now that showed that since 2002, the price of a frozen pizza has actually gone down, not just in real terms, but in actual pounds and pence terms. While at the same time, the price of tomatoes has gone up 46%, and the price of tuna had gone up 200 and something percent. But there's real costs if we're all living on a diet of frozen, pretty lousy pizza, which is what we're talking about. There's health costs, there's environmental costs. And so what we need to do is actually make that healthy food available to everybody. And we've got to make sure everyone has the income to actually meet that need. So, we talk about making the minimum wage a living wage. If you work full time, you should earn enough money to live on. And we've set a target for 2020 of a minimum wage of £10 an hour by that date of 2020. And that's based on living wage now, and then 4% increase year on year going through, so people have a sense of certainty and improvement in their lives. And that's defined as a living wage, so it needs to meet people's costs.
But how, for example, are you going to make sure that the average student loan or grant that's given to students will cover the costs of the new production of food?
Well, since we're talking student finance, I have to mention that we would have free tuition, free education. So that takes one burden off. And the other thing, we support the idea of a citizen's income or basic income, and that would mean that you get your basic costs. We're looking at the moment at the current levels at about £80 an hour, £80 a week. To meet your basic needs. You might be able to work a little bit if you want a bit more than that, but you're providing people with basic needs. And what we've got to do is match up the price and the food and make sure everyone gets enough.
So, if we just go back a little bit there and touch on tuition fees, and obviously you say that you would abolish them. Obviously, a lot of students will hear this and think, this has been said before, and it's not been fulfilled.
The Lib Dems have a lot to do.
How are you going to make sure that, if, next general election you get sufficient numbers, that this policy is carried out and we don't get another sense of students feeling like they've been cheated?
Well, I think first of all it's worth saying in 2010 we had a fully costed election manifesto that included zero tuition fees, and we'll have next year another fully costed manifesto that explains exactly how we're paying for it. So that will all be worked out there. But there's a philosophical point behind here that needs to be made, which is education is a public good. Whether it's an NVQ or a PhD or anything in between, it's good for the whole of society to have a more educated population. And that should then be paid for from progressive, much more progressive than it is now, taxation. So that if you get a maths PhD and go off into the city, and we'd hope to stop this, but create the next complex financial instrument and make a lot of money, then you should pay a lot in taxes. If you get a social work degree and go and run a community garden, you shouldn't go through your life with that weight of debt sitting on your shoulder for 30 years that you're never going to pay back. You're using your education for good, and that should be recognised.
Okay, so if we continue with supporting students, now obviously in terms of housing, your policy is very much introducing more social housing and making it more accessible. But how are you going to make sure that this is well balanced? Because obviously, Bath in itself, if we take that as an example, Bath Uni alone has approximately 22,000 students. A few years ago, there was a legislation, Article 4, passed, which reduced the number of houses multiple occupancy that were allowed. So how are you going to make sure that universities that are also continuing to develop, that societies can cater for not only extra intake of students but residents who may want who own houses privately? How would that work?
Well, I think one of the things at the moment we have the whole idea of housing development is, very often on green belt or greenfield sites, on the edges of towns, very expensive houses that the private developers think they can make the most money out of. You have to have two incomes at least to meet the mortgage cost. You're probably going to have to run 2 cars because there's no public transport out on those kind of things. That's not the kind of housing that we need, but it's the kind of housing that we're getting. What we need is genuinely affordable social housing, student housing, close to existing facilities where people, where there's doctors' surgeries and schools and all the other things that you need. And that means you're saying to the developers, yes, on that brownfield site over there, you mightn't make as large a profit, but that's if you want to build houses is where you need to build. Or indeed, what we need to do is allow local councils to borrow, because it's prudential borrowing. You know what return you're going to get on social housing or indeed on student housing. And I was very impressed actually, the University of Northampton, which I visited recently. At the moment we've seen a huge rush of private student housing, very often owned by private equity companies that happen to be based in the Cayman Islands, and charging very large for what rooms that often have some very fancy technology but are pretty basic underneath. And yet, but in the University of Northampton, they said, why should the private companies get the profits? We're building our own student accommodation and we're providing it to our students at a reasonable price and making a modest profit for the university that can go back into the university. And that really was a really interesting model of how to do things differently.
Okay, I mean, if we talk about the local council, over the last couple of weeks, a councillor in our local area who was elected in a student area has proposed that students in Bath should pay council tax. I mean, what do you think about this?
Well, I think that's just ridiculous in terms of the, once again, I mean, there's been some really interesting statistics out on this in the last day or so of how much we're seeing society being weighted for the benefit of older people. And huge amount of weight being put on younger people. Now, of course, I mean, there are still some older people who are really struggling to get by, but if you look at the two groups collectively, we can't keep piling student debt, piling costs on our young people, and then also sending them out into a workforce where there's very few permanent, decently paid jobs. I talk about jobs that you can build a life on, which everybody needs, but particularly you need at the start of your working life, and that means at least living wage. It means no 0 hours contracts, and it means a reasonable degree of security so that you can think, I get this job, I can see some hope of advancement, I can see this job still being there in a year or 2 or 3 years' time if I want to stick with it. And we're just not creating those kind of jobs for young people at the moment.
So you think something like introducing the council tax in this area would kind of give students the wrong attitude about what to aspire to? Or? Well,
no, I mean, I think it's just wrong in terms of students don't have the capacity to pay. And that's the wrong direction. Ultimately, what we'd like to see, and this probably is a bit complicated to get into now. Council tax is a deeply regressive tax. Someone who lives in a £10 million mansion in Chelsea, I'm probably understating that. It probably should be higher than that. But millions and millions of pounds in Chelsea, is probably paying only double the council tax of someone living in a council flat in Bath, and it's the way it's arranged has to change, and we call for a land value tax and a whole change in the system. But that's clearly the wrong direction to go in.
Okay, I mean, if we talk about local councils and how they would work, your policy on your website states that you'd look to introduce more localised elected committees in areas, and that they would be elected more frequently. I think it suggests annually even. I mean, if we look at student voting at Bath specifically, we could only achieve a voter turnout for our student officer elections of 28.5%. How do you think this policy would work, in encouraging students to vote in the local community if we're struggling to achieve that within our own university community itself?
Well, I think one of the things we need to think about is educating young people, students, people before they come to university, about democracy. And one of the things is, there's very little, lots of people say, when they've left school, I never really learnt about voting and democracy, and what's this difference between Brussels and Westminster and my local council, and how does it all fit together? I think one of the ways, obviously we need more education in schools about that, but also what we need is, one of the things we need is more democracy in schools. Because if you've had some elections right through your school years, starting pretty young, and those people you've elected have been able to make, you know, some significant difference to your life, not sort of what colours a school badge should be or something, but things more substantial than that. And if you just think the way we run things is by voting, then you take that attitude through your life. And that's something we desperately need to do, is educate people more about democracy, but also get people doing democracy from a very young age. And you know, the Green Party has very long been in favour of votes at 16. Because if you think about it, actually, votes, the way we have now, votes at 18, if your birthday is the day before the general election, you'll actually be 23 before you get your first vote, which is quite really ridiculous when you think about it. So I think, you know, we should definitely bring the voting age down to 16, get more democracy in schools, get more education about democracy so everyone understands the system. Then what you normally, you know, and this is what you find broadly in the over 60s. You know, people think, you know, voting is just something you do as a citizen, that's part of your role in life, and yet we've really lost a lot of that.
Okay, I mean, moving entirely onto a different subject now. We obviously are a student media group. We're here from CampusTV today, but we've obviously also got Bath Impact, our newspaper, and University Radio Bath. Many people might not know this about you, but you were obviously trained as a journalist. So how did you get into the industry?
I'm afraid my story is very much, you know, I'm 48. My story is very much a story of 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, that doesn't really apply today. But my first degree was agricultural science. I got towards the end of that and thought, this is not what I want to do with my life. And thought, I don't want to be a specialist, I want to be a generalist. And being a journalist just appealed to me. So I did I think I did 3 weeks work experience, and I wrote, in my last year of university, I wrote for the local paper a column for nothing. And then I went and got my first job. And I'm well aware that these days that sounds incredibly luxurious. And I was, even in my first job, I wasn't as a cadet, I was properly paid, really quite decently paid as a journalist. And I mean, I did have quite a lot of responsibility. I was the only journalist running a local newspaper, a weekly paper. So I wrote the whole paper, which was an enormous amount of fun.
I can imagine.
But I think, you know, my advice to sort of young people wanting to be journalists today, and you know, it's a hell of a lot tougher out there now, and it's you know, it's really dreadfully tough. But you know, you might have to actually think about creating your own job, and that means, you know, thinking about, there's lots of exciting things happening in hyper local kind of journalism. Dorset Eye is one I always mention. You know, the Hackney Gazette. People who are creating their own publications, because it's very hard to break in to existing media, and you know, at most levels it's astonishingly badly paid. And so, you know, think about getting all of your own experience of media, you know, as much as you can, doing it for yourself, and thinking about, you know, maybe it's not what you were thinking about when you started, but thinking about saying, you know, where's there a niche that follows my interests that I can fill. A few years ago, as editor of the Guardian Weekly, I was at a University of East London. I was very impressed by a guy who was the blogger on Korean film, and he was actually getting, you know, the occasional commission from the Guardian to write about Korean film, because he was clearly the expert on Korean film. And you know, that's the kind of way you can carve yourself out a niche and find a way forward, I think.
I mean, I've certainly sat myself in a lot of conferences and talks, you know, within the profession, and a lot of the resounding advice seems to be the multimedia route. You know, make sure you have more than just one skill. Do you think that's a solution? Or
I think that's essential. I think that's basically now an utter given. You know, you can't just say I'm a print journalist, or you know, I just present television or whatever. You do have to do everything. I mean, I do quite often sympathise with you know, even BBC journalists now, is, you know, they're juggling 6 different implements. Like, hang on while I take a photo with my iPhone for the tweet, and now hang on, I'm pulling out the radio mic. Now hang on, I'm sticking on the camera on my shoulder. You know, and it's not good for journalism. But it's where we are, and you've got to be prepared for that.
Thank you very much for your time, and I bet it's been a really good interview.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the discussion.